This is a gorget, an item that you're probably used to seeing hanging around the necks of proud and gallant officers, strutting about in all their shiny finery. For over 100 years, these things would be worn by pretty much every rank of commission-holding officers in most European armies, at least Western European armies, from lowly ensigns to high and mighty majors and colonels and whatnot. Curiously enough, actually, you'd also find them on occasion hanging around the necks of Native American chiefs as well. But why is all of that? What purpose do these curious little crescents actually serve? What made them so important, and why were they so popular? Now, if, unlike myself, you speak French, you'll notice that when you take off the T off of gorget, you get gauge, gauge, however you pronounce it. It means neck. The rough translation, I suppose, of the French word is neck. Back in the Middle Ages, specifically back in the days of the heavy plate armor, rather than like mail and whatnot, the term gorget referred to a piece of armor that would actually fit between one's helmet and the breastplate, on the neck. Without it, one might imagine that the neck would be rather dangerously exposed whenever you happen to lift your head or turn it around, anything like that at all. This is sort of an empty spot, but you want to make sure there's something there between the two layers. Now, I'm sure you can get a lot more into the specifics with all of that, and I know that there's a lot of other kinds of armor that could protect the neck, and it probably varied an awful lot by more specific time periods and whatnot, like if they're using gorgets or some other variant and whatnot. None of that, though, is really my area of expertise. If anyone now happens to have more information on those earlier days of the gorget and related neck-protecting armor, well, feel free to comment it down below. But for our purposes, we're primarily looking at the 18th century. Just know that the rough idea of this piece has its origins in medieval armor. Now, of course, as warfare changed and developed over the years, the efficiency of armor in battle and on campaign, all of these things began to decrease. Certain types of armor began to sort of drop off on the priority list. Greaves, for example, the things that would protect the legs, and different kinds of arm protection sort of begin to fall off. Through much of the 17th century, you might see soldiers and officers moving around with breastplates and helmets, but not really all that much beyond that. And then by the early days of the 18th century, it becomes really quite rare to see anyone other than the heaviest of cavalry or nobles posing for the occasional portrait really wearing much armor at all. But during that slow shedding of heavy protective gear through the ages, one piece, sort of like a vestigial limb of sorts, remained: the gorget. By the time you've lost literally all other armor, helmets, breastplates, and all that, the gorget's protective value, it can usually be up here, but the gorget's protective value is pretty much non-existent, at least in a combat scenario, and it becomes very inconvenient to carry around just because of all the weight, and it's like why have this if you're not going to have all the rest of it? Rather, it became a status symbol, a symbol of power, harkening back to an older, more chivalric age, and that, of course, is an appropriate symbol, much like a sword or a polearm, for an officer and a gentleman to be carrying with them. It's a bit lighter, it's easy, it's simple and visible to carry around with you without really getting too much in the way. At least that's what the gorgets became. Those earlier forms of the actual armor, probably not so convenient, but you'll see how they rapidly shift away from being such clunky pieces to being more symbolic. Before the introduction of things like chevrons and other more direct indicators of a rank, you could really only tell officers apart by things like the kinds of clothing that they wore. Little details on their coats, coloring, lacing, the kinds of sashes that they would wear, and then, of course, the equipment that they carried, swords, polearms, fusees, things like that. My compatriot Chris P. actually has a video on exactly that subject, which I will link down below if you'd like to learn more about that particular subject. And during the long 18th century, the gorget was really one of those myriad of ways to tell a commissioned officer apart from an NCO or a private soldier. More specifically, gorgets were worn whenever an officer was on duty. If they weren't working, they wouldn't wear them. It is a physical, it is a clearly visual way to indicate to everyone surrounding that you are on some kind of official business. You are an officer on duty. You can sort of think of it like think of it as a badge of office in that way, if you will, vaguely at least. The size and the shaping, the exact method of how the gorgets were worn, how high up they were worn, things like that, would, as you expect, vary from nation to nation and from time period to time period. It It was, after all, just as much, if not more so actually, a matter of military fashion rather than of military practicality. But broadly speaking, earlier gorgets tended to be very, very large, very wide things in comparison with the later years, and looking at some of those paintings, you can sort of see how they're coming very directly, that clear line of lineage coming from older pieces of armor, which would actually go around the neck for protection. If you just raise the thing up to a more appropriate level, you can see how it sort of might serve that basic function. Though, of course, that's nothing close to what I'm wearing here today. In later years, they would get very much smaller. They would get lighter as well, and with more intricate decoration. You can see here that mine has the royal crest on it, the royal coat of arms, if you will, and then there's a G and an R just over there for George's Rex. And then, of course, I have it hanging with 2 green rosettes with 54th buttons on in the center of each rosette, and then it's tied around my neck using a green and red ribbon to match the color scheme of my regiment, the 54th, with that popinjay green. The tops of the gorget would grow increasingly narrow with time. You can see here how it's sort of bending inwards like that, giving it that more iconic crescent sort of shape until, well, soon enough, again, you can see with mine, it's utterly impossible to actually fit this thing around my neck. It can only hang lower down on my chest around where the heart is. So now to change theme a little bit, how did these symbols of chivalric authority of European officers sometimes wind up in the hand of Native American chieftains? Well, why do we have all those portraits of Native Americans wearing gorgets, much like a British or a French or a Spanish officer might? Did they steal them on raids and wear them as prizes of conquest? Well, no, of course. Actually, they were more often than not given by Europeans to Native Americans as trade goods, sort of a sign of respect. The natives, of course, would have seen these items being worn by those same British, French, Spanish, and other officers, and appropriately recognized them as symbols of power and authority among Westerners. By their wearing a gorget, they could convey their own authority in a fashion that the European armies would more directly relate to. And on the obverse as well, by giving a native leader a symbol of power within your own culture, the Europeans would be able to show that they respect that leader on their own level. So not only was the gorget sort of a military piece for both Western armies and Native Americans, it was also a piece of cultural exchange. I should also mention, I imagine, that that practice was not only limited to Native Americans. It was actually a pretty common practice with Native peoples all around the world, particularly in places like Australia, where again the British would very commonly gift gorgets to Aborigine dignitaries and whatnot, Aborigine leaders, to again show them that they are sort of on the same level, if you will, so when they're dealing with them. The gorget would stop seeing use in the British Army, and in fact most others as well, in the years sort of just after the Napoleonic Wars, the early Victorians, I think like 1830s is when they really start falling out of fashion, though some nations would continue the tradition in some form or other. Actually, many German states, for example, would continue to use them for quite a while, and they are even actually used in some German military police units up to the Second World War, again, sort of on and off in terms of how they apply them and whatnot. I don't think they're as a sign of marking out officers, but rather just of the MPs on the whole. Again, I'm not entirely familiar with it, but I do know that that German military gendarme, or something like that, Feldgendarme, I think is what they were called, would use a very wide gorget-looking pieces held by a chain around the neck. And then, of course, because the Germans, the Prussians particularly, were some of the only people continuing to use the gorget in at least some limited aspect into the Victorian era, well, when the Prussians went over to train the Chilean military, that's a whole other story. Long story short, basically, the Chilean parade style is very heavily inspired by Prussian parade traditions. A lot of their ceremonial uniforms alongside the parade stuff are basically coming like straight out of pre-Great War Germany. Well, you can see in the Chilean military that a lot of their own ensigns, or at least they're filling the role of an ensign. I don't know if the actual rank is ensign, what they are exactly, but they're carrying a flag, so they're basically fulfilling the role of an ensign. Those guys are still wearing gorgets while they're on parade, and actually, again, very similar to the Germanic ones, very large, very wide ones, although I'm not sure if they're being held on by a chain. I'll have to look back at the parade footage, but very Germanic on them, which is interesting again. They're sort of carrying on that tradition even after the Germans have kind of changed up how they do things on the parade. Indeed, the Chilean military is really the only one that I can think of, at least off the top of my head, that continues to use gorgets in the 21st century. There's probably some other ones around there, one or two armies nowadays that continue to use them in some capacity or other. I just can't think of them at the moment. It's unfortunate as well the Chileans don't have all their officers wearing gorgets. It's only the one kind, whatever that rank may be, the guys who are carrying the colors on parade. But it's a good look. Personally, I much prefer the smaller, more vestigial limb type looking gorgets that are so utterly pointless in terms of practicality, but they look really good. Oh, they look so good, don't they? They look good. They look really good. In any case, my dear viewer, that is the wonderful world of the gorget. Thank you also very much for watching, of course in particular to my ever-beneficent supporting classes on patreon.com, for it is by virtue of your support that I am able to carry on with the work that I do. Until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.